examinus tecum, benedicat tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu. Ave
Just ahead on Eyewitness News, church attendance was up at a Prince William County church where some parishioners claim to have witnessed a miracle.
Hundreds of people are flocking to the small town of Lake Ridge, Virginia, hoping to experience a supernatural phenomenon. While it isn't exactly a pilgrimage, many are going to witness an event that some believe is divine.
Is it holy or a hoax? Seeing Christ's wounds on a young priest. As CNN's Francis Harden reports, the church hierarchy is skeptical, but many people are not.
I'm Marie Pelletier. I am the Office and Business Manager for St. Elizabeth Seton Catholic Church in Lake Ridge. I have been in this job for the past 23 years. It's been a very long time and a very wonderful time. I first met Father Jim, or Father Bruse, when he was assigned to our parish. He was the parochial vicar. He was a very kind, warm, gentle, and very humble man. He was more like my brother than a priest. He was a good friend, and we used to do a lot of things together. We would shop, and we would just, have lunch together and do a lot of things. It was like a family atmosphere for us. When Father Jim first told me about the statues, I can just remember him standing in the doorway of his office. My desk was right outside of his office, and we talked a lot about a lot of things, but I remember the day that he came and was telling me about the statues at his parents' house and how it affected him and how he wasn't sure the meaning of all this and why it was happening to him. It was an incredible time for us. He was very uplifted by all of this. He started out with a lot of doubts. His own personal feeling was he wasn't sure if he had a true vocation to the priesthood, and he was beginning to doubt it. And he had told me that he had prayed a lot to God and to Jesus, that if this was meant to be, if he was to be a priest, he really wanted God to let him know in some way. And sure enough, his prayer was answered. It was answered in a very big way, but his prayers were answered not only for him, but for a lot of people. When he told me about the statues, it was something that is not an everyday occurrence. I mean, for this to happen in this small little town of Lake Ridge, in this church that was nestled in a residential neighborhood, for this to happen to us here at that particular time was an incredible, incredible miracle. For me, it was a miracle. Other people called it a phenomenon. But if you saw the things that I did and experienced some of these happenings, you would know that it's not a phenomenon. I believe it was miracles. It brought out a lot of good things in our parish. Of course, there were a lot of other things that went on that were not so good, but that always comes. these statues, the tearing statues, brought many people to the church. We had thousands of people come. There were thousands and people who came from all over the world, from Japan, from India, from Italy, from France. All they wanted to do was to see Father Jim, to see the statues. It was incredible. And then again, on the other hand, the media attention turned our church into a little bit of a circus. They were very pressing, very, very aggressive, and they wanted to see him and to talk to him, and they wanted him to touch statues. And that was very difficult because it wasn't a show. It wasn't something that he could pick up a statue and make it cry just because they wanted him to. That was the bad part about this. I frequently had to take Father Jim over to my house to keep the media away from him because they were just very, very persistent and very aggressive. And it was difficult because we were trying to work through everything that was happening, having the statues tear and cry, and Father Jim having the stigmata. It brought a lot of people out, a lot of people together, a lot of people wanting to convert, a lot of people wanting to go to confession. There were people 30 years who hadn't been inside a church, but yet here they were coming because of this man, because of what was happening. But Father Jim always said it was never him. It was always God working through him. He was a very humble man that way. He never, ever took credit for anything. It was always God working through him. There were people who were very demanding of Father Jim. I remember one incident, a gentleman came in and was very adamant that Father Jim go with him immediately to bless his son-in-law, that he wanted a miracle and he wanted a miracle right now, and get Father Jim and let's go and do this. The unfortunate part about it is Father Jim wasn't there, but this is just an indication of what some people were like. They really didn't see beyond what they wanted. You know, it really was the will of God, and that's what Father Jim tried to tell people. Whatever God has in store for you, this is what we should pray for. This is what we should look for. Not miracles. It's always great to hope for miracles and think that, yes, why not me? But the main message was, whatever God's will, that's what we have to accept, and let's pray for that.
My name is Margaret Ann Orlevich. I currently reside in Silver Spring Township, Pennsylvania. In February 1992, I was a resident of Alexandria, Virginia, and a member of Blessed Sacrament Catholic Church. At that time, I heard of a weeping statue of our Blessed Mother in St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Church, Lake Ridge, Virginia. The statue is known as Our Lady of the Smile, and this is a small version of that statue. On Friday, March 20, 1992, I went to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Church to attend the 9 a.m. Mass. I arrived early so that I could see the statue before Mass began. I entered the church and walked down the right side aisle, which led directly to the statue. As I approached the statue, I was amazed at what I was seeing. Tears were flowing from the eyes down the front of the statue and onto the floor. I realized at that moment that I was witnessing a miraculous event. The statue of our Blessed Mother wept for approximately 40 minutes that morning. This beautiful experience has changed my life in many ways. Most importantly, it has brought me closer to Jesus and closer to the Blessed Mother. And that's where I want to remain always, close to Jesus and close to the Blessed Mother.
I just remember watching the evening news, and that's when I found out, because they were all of a sudden they were showing St. Elizabeth Seton Church, and that I was astonished. I said, "Oh my gosh, that's our church!" And so then the next day, I went to daily mass because I started going with Eric, because Eric was going to daily mass, and the next day I went to mass, and it was me and about 500 of my nearest and dearest friends at mass, and TV cameras and all kinds of people that I never saw before, and that daily mass became full, and weekend mass was crazy, and we would have to line up. You know, you have to come about half an hour early just for weekend mass if you wanted to have a seat inside the church. And I remember a friend of Mike's calling. It was Missy. Missy called, our son Mike, and she was crying, and she was afraid that she didn't know what this all meant, and she was afraid this meant it was the end of the world, and Revelations was coming true, and this was the apocalypse and all this stuff. And so Mike was reassuring her that everything was okay, and that just because the statues were crying didn't mean this was the end of the world. And then there was a gathering of people who wanted to help, because so many people wanted to visit the statue. There were probably 30 or 40 of us that started helping to just stand with the statue and just assure people that this was not fake, because a lot of people would come in and they would say, oh, well, there's like little pipes and wires and things inside so that it makes her cry. And I said, there's nothing inside here. I said she's made of plaster of Paris, and I think it was plaster of Paris. But she's not solid, but there was nothing inside where there were any pipes or anything that could be jury-rigged to make her appear to cry. And so people would be asking us all these questions, and they would want to touch her, and we had to say, well, if you have a rosary or a Bible or a prayer card or something that you want, then we would touch it to her hand or her face, or touch it to the tears. If there were pooling tears on her face or at the base, then we would touch it and get the tears on there and then hand it back to them, and they would like that.
I was still in the Navy at the time, so I had work to go to, so my experience was mostly just on the weekend, and I realized there was lots of people there. I didn't know what it meant. I never saw the statue tearing, but over time I talked to so many people, good friends, that I trusted it. If it happened to them, I believe it. And just wasn't one person, 2 people, 3 people. It was lots of people, and that was truly amazing. What struck me was also that there weren't any messages or anything apparently from this, but as Father Jim would say, it's kind of a sign of God's presence, and he's just showing us that he's there and he cares for us. Something that struck me also was that it did affect people spiritually. There were a lot of people that started to go to daily mass. We have one good friend, Madeline, who essentially came back to the church, if I remember right, and my gosh, talk about a convert or reconversion, because then her faith became very important to her, and so it was very inspiring, to hear stories like that, to see it actually happening to people, and in a very, very positive way. I think it's kind of funny that even in Scripture it talks about people want to see signs and wonders, and even I guess Jesus chastises people from time to time. Why do you need this stuff? And yet a lot of people come. I was guilty of it too. I'd come and here's a statue that we just got back from my mom or the estate recently, and I took this in. I thought, well, maybe this will cry. I'll give it to my mom as a present. Wouldn't that be cool? Have a statue that's teared. Probably the wrong reason for taking a statue there, but at any rate, I did it.
And I remember Father Bruse would have tape and bandages around his wrist, and he would be quite edgy. I don't know how to describe it. You would see him up there, and it was obviously bothering him a lot. When the readings were happening or whatever, and he was sitting, and he would just sit there, and you could see him clenching his fists and like that, because he was obviously in some discomfort. Yeah. Well, he said that to him the biggest message was Mary saying, "I'm here," and this isn't just a fluke. She wanted people to know that she was here, and that she was very aware of what's going on in the world.
All right, I'm Pat Wahus, and I was a member of the parish during the time of the statues crying and Father Jim's stigmata. I was on the parish council, and we'd had a retreat, and Father Dan asked us to stay a little bit later because he needed to share something with us. And what he shared was that Father Jim was experiencing the stigmata. I said, "Oh, sure thing," and I believe it when I see it. And so he pulled down his shirt, or pulled up his shirt sleeves, and his hands were bleeding, and he took his shoes off, and his feet were bleeding, and went to pull his shirt up, and I said, "That's enough. I'm the doubting Thomas, and I have learned my lesson." And after that, I saw such a change in this man. He became very, very serious about what he was doing, and very caring, and he got out of his shyness. He was able to help people where he couldn't before. And many times I would be in church, and I'd clean up after the statues cried. I never saw them myself, but I would get towels. You didn't just clean it up with a Kleenex. You had to get towels. There was always so much water. And then one Sunday I was helping Father get ready for early Mass, and I slipped on the way out of the room, and I looked down, and the floor was all wet. And we couldn't figure out where the water was coming from, and we looked up, and there was a crucifix above the door, and it was crying, and it had cried it because I never did actually see it cry, but the water was on the floor. And then Jim said to me, Father Jim said that I needed to get Marie because he was bleeding again, and he didn't want anyone to see it, and he didn't want to have any of the blood go on the altar cloths. So I had to go tell everyone Mass would be late, and then Marie came over and took care of binding up his arms so that the blood wouldn't come onto the vestments. And that was about all I saw.
My name is Dave Wahus, and I was a member of the parish when the miracles happened here at St. Elizabeth and Seton. I remember my wife was a member of the parish council, and I remember her coming home from the parish council meeting, and she told me about the announcement that Father Bruse had made at the parish council meeting. She came home and she told me about this, and then it's a matter of weeks and through the next months, the number of people coming to the church just it multiplied vastly. I was an usher during that period of time, and we would normally people come to church about 15 minutes before Mass, and we would have people come in an hour, 45 minutes before Mass to sit here, and they would be coming over to the statues that were over here in the corner. And they'd want to touch the statue that was crying. It wasn't necessarily crying at the time, but they'd want to touch it. It came to the point where there were so many people coming that we had to put a rope barrier around it. And then we had to post ushers to keep people from touching the papier-mâché statues. I remember we came in one time and one of the fingers, I believe it's Jesus' finger, was broken off. Came back the next week, and somebody had put it on, had glued it back on, but they glued it on back upside down so that the nail faces the palm rather than away from the palm of the hand. And I think it's still that way to this day. One of our biggest challenges was to keep the photographers out. Father Dan told us that there'd be no photography during the Mass, and that was a real challenge. We weren't always successful, but we worked hard at it. I worked as we were building the new church, I was a member of the Interior Design Committee, and I remember one day we were meeting in the rectory, and we were talking about a number of things, and I mentioned that I'd never seen one of the statues crying. And so we walked into Father Bruce's office, and there was a bust of the Blessed Mother sitting on a shelf behind his desk, and it was sitting on a towel, and the tears were coming out of the eyes of the Blessed Mother's eyes, and it was running down onto the towel. You could touch the towel, and it was absolutely soaked. Then he started to tell us about a statue, a Fatima statue, that was about maybe 8 inches tall. a statue that he had been given, and it was when it was given to him, it was a pure white ceramic statue, and he was telling us how the colors, as he had held it, and over a period of time, after touching it and holding it, how the robes had turned nice pastel colors, and the flowers around the feet of the Blessed Mother had turned into different pastel colors. He went up to his bedrooms, his personal suite, to show it to us, and as he came down the steps, he handed me the statue, and the statue was crying, and the tears ran down her robes, and she was beautiful colors, no longer white, and you could see that there was no paint on the statue, and the tears fell on my hands.
Weep. Debate continues while church leaders say they're worried about the circus-like atmosphere produced by the controversy. Good evening, I'm Renee Poussant. Susan King is off tonight. Hundreds of people have been flocking to the church since reports of the weeping statues first surfaced last week.
I'm Teresa Didymo, and this is Hector Didymo. We've lived in St. Elizabeth Seton Parish for 27 years, since 1978, when we moved here. We experienced the weeping statues and Father Bruse. Hector was in the Knights of Columbus, and he would pick up Father Bruse for their monthly Mass and meeting of the Fourth Degree Knights of Columbus. And at the time, Father Bruse was not the most popular priest in the parish. He was kind of bashful, had very short sermons, which we all liked a lot. And so Hector would pick him up and take him to Mass. One night, Hector came home from the Knights of Columbus meeting, and he told me about the statue crying, that Father Bruse had taken all the men upstairs and showed them the weeping statue, and that was the first that I heard about it. And then all hell broke loose, and we had tour buses and all kinds of people come. And we had guards for the statue after baby Jesus' finger got broken off, and people were stealing things. Even the spindles on the toilet paper rolls were stolen. And so we had guards stand by the statue so that no one would touch the statue. And one thing that's outstanding in my memory is the statue was crying, and there was water dripping from the holder, whatever you call it, the pillar that it was standing on, down onto the floor. And a very elderly lady who could barely walk was being helped up the aisle by her two adult grandsons, one on either side of her. And they helped her to kneel down in the water on the floor, and she was crying and she was praying. And when she got up again, I was standing there as a guard, and I said something to her grandson about how she was so emotional, and he said, oh, she was crying because she forgot her rosary, and she wanted to bring her rosary with her. She had left it at home, and they had come quite some distance, I forget where from. And I had my rosary in my hand, so I handed it over to her, and she immediately put it in the water that was on the floor, and she was so grateful. And they went back down the aisle, and they got the old lady in the car, and the grandson brought me the rosary back. And I said, oh no, I said, she can keep that herself because I'm sure she would want to have it. And then they left. That was all I remember about that lady. But one day after the Knights of Columbus meeting, it was late in the evening, and Hector brought Father Bruse over here just to have something to drink and hang out for a little while. And I have a number of statues that were given to me as First Communion gifts when I made my First Communion when I was 7 years old. So they're about 55 years old now, and this is one of them. This is a statue of Our Lady of Fatima, and I was showing them to Father Bruse, and he blessed this one statue, but not the others. And as he was carrying it like you would carry a baby in his arm, the statue started to cry. And as soon as he left, the statue stopped crying, and it never cried again. But we kept it on the mantle for a number of weeks, And I would notice just on days that I would go dust or was sitting here watching TV or something, the statue would change colors. It changed from white to pink to blue to yellow. And some of the color, I don't know if you can pick it up, inside here, has stayed on the statue. It used to be all white with a gold trim, and now it has some blue in here. But there were times that the back of the statue would kind of fade into a pink and then a blue or a yellow. And now it's all white again like it was originally, except for this little bit right here in the front.
I think we had noticed that result of the events then, that the church attendance had grown. Of course, the area grew, but especially during that time period, the church attendance from just the local people, never mind the visitors, had increased profoundly.
My name is Louise Rochette. I've been a parishioner at St. Elizabeth since 1988. And when word started getting out about the weeping statues, I happened to go to the rectory to purchase, to get a Mass card for some relative that passed away. And I saw in the corner of the room of the office a little table, and on the table was a small statue of a Madonna, and there was a doily underneath, and the doily was wet. And I happened to say to the secretary, "Is that something happening over there?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, a lot of that has been happening around here." So that was the first incidence where I experienced or saw evidence of the weeping statues. And then shortly after that, it was Easter Sunday, and we went to Mass, my husband and I and our children, and we had a tendency to normally sit sort of on the side toward the back, but we happened to get towards the front, and the Medjugorje statue that had been always to the right had been moved closer to the altar, just to the right of the altar, and more forward, and we were only about 3 pews away. And I leaned over to my husband and I said, is anything happening? He had gotten into the pew before me, and he said, "Well, look, you can see it." And what you could see was the statue is such that Mary's holding the baby Jesus and his little arms are out, and they're basically extended under her face, and the tears had fallen from her face, and they were hanging, they were sort of suspended, some little tears on the baby's arms, and that's what we had seen. And I think the main thing it does for me is, I told someone, I can remember in my life sometimes going to bed at night, even though I've been Catholic my entire life, and thinking, gee, what if it isn't true, and what if we just die? And after seeing that, I have no doubt, it just took away any doubt I'll ever have that there's something bigger than us going on that we're meant to get to.
My name is Marcy Grattan, and I am one of the founding families of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish. I am a widow now, but at the time I had my husband and my 3 children, and I continue to be a member of St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish. I got to witness quite a few happenings during the time when Father Bruse had the stigmata and statues were weeping. I was teaching at Aquinas School at the time, and I heard through some friends that there were crying statues and that Father had the stigmata, but I wasn't like in the first group to hear about it, because the people who worked in the parish and knew about it really were trying to keep it quiet, and that was Father's wish, the way I understand it. However, more and more people were finding out, and I believe that what was happening was it was going to be in the media soon. And because they knew that, some of the people started telling their friends. So I had heard about it, a week or so before it became public knowledge. And I can remember that one of the first things I did, and I've only told this story in recent years because at the time it happened, I only told my husband and I was going to tell nobody else. I was very curious, and I had choir practice on Wednesday evenings, and I got there early. The church was open, and this was the old church, the church that we had at the time, that we now call our activities building. I went to look at that statue of Mary, and I wanted to see if I could see anything at all. And it was interesting. At that time, that statue of Mary was on it wasn't on a pedestal, but it was on a platform that came out of the wall. I thought she was attached to that platform. And I had noticed that there was glistening around the base of the statue, between the statue and the platform, and I didn't know if maybe that was leftover tears or if that was the glue that attached the statue to the platform. And all I did was put my hands at the bottom there to feel if it was wet or not, and the statue started to go exactly like this, and I caught the statue in my hands and put her back. To this day, I think about the fact that I could have been the person that would have broken the statue that cried many tears, and luckily I was not. I did, on that Saturday, go back to church, and there were a lot of people around the statue, and she was crying at that time. And that's the first time I saw any statue cry. Even then, all of these people some people were down on their knees, and they were crossing themselves, and a lot of people were saying things out loud. I, on the other hand, was looking at the statue, trying to work my way through the crowd. I got around the people, went to the back of the statue. I'm looking at the back of the statue. I'm looking up at the ceiling. And I happen to be by nature a scientist, and empirical data means a lot to me. And I was looking at all of this to see if there was some other cause, and I didn't see anything. And I just watched that statue cry, and I was really amazed at that. With the exception of Fatima or Lourdes, anything that we would hear in modern day times, we would sort of feel, because we're so intelligent and educated here, that is this really happening? Or when people would observe these kind of things, it seemed that more often they were happening in areas where it was a rural area and not a well-educated populace. So all of a sudden now, here we are in the middle of Lake Ridge, Virginia, in the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, a highly educated group of people, and we are seeing something like this happening. Amazing. At Aquinas School, the priests from the different parishes, at that time we had 4 parishes that sent students to that school, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton being one of the 4 parishes. And the priests would take turns coming to say Mass for the students one day a week. And one time when it was Father Bruce's turn, he was there at Mass. We already knew about everything that was happening. And I think that this was either on St. Patrick's Day or close to St. Patrick's Day. And that goes to another story that I'll tell you in a few minutes. However, on that day, while we were at Mass, one of the teachers came and started whispering to some of us teachers who were sitting toward the back of the church that the statue of Mary that was out in the vestibule area was crying. So I, of course, got up and during Mass and looked, and there she was, definitely crying. And after Mass, we brought the children out class by class so that they could indeed see the statue of Mary crying.
And on the reports of more weeping statues at another Catholic church in Prince William County. Stay tuned for details.
Hi, my name is Libby Lawler, and I'm a member of the St. Elizabeth Ann Seton Parish, and I'm also the kindergarten teacher at Aquinas School in Woodbridge, Virginia, now renamed to the St. Thomas Aquinas Regional School. I first heard about Father Jim when a member of the parish called me on the phone one evening and said to me, Libby, is it true that Father Jim has the stigmata? And I immediately started to laugh because I thought, Father Jim would probably be the last person I would suspect would get the stigmata. He's a very down-to-earth, simple person. We all loved him because of that. And we appreciated how quickly he said Mass. Then my sons, having gone to Aquinas school, then knew what the stigmata was. Well, we found it hard to believe. But the next day I went to school, and I went up to Linda Christie's classroom door, and she teaches in our 6th grade at Aquinas. And I said to her, Linda, you're not going to believe about the telephone call that I got last night. And she came out of her classroom, and she shut the door, and we stood in the hall. And I told her about the phone call. She said, well, now I have something to tell you. And she said to me, it's true. She said not too many people had been aware of it at that point. It was maybe at about 4 o'clock, and Mary Blenner, my next-door neighbor, came over, and she said to me, Libby, I was just at the church, and the statue was crying. Now, that's the big statue of, I believe it's called Our Lady of the Smiles. And so my boys and I got in the car and immediately went over to the church, and sure enough, the statue was crying. Well, my husband came home, and my husband grew up in a Catholic home where his mother had great devotion to the Blessed Virgin. And I told him about it, and he believed me. But you know how you always like to have somebody see it, too. You just don't like to have your word taken for it. So that next Saturday, I believe it was, Joe and I went to 9 o'clock Mass in the morning, and the statue was crying. So he also saw the statue crying. That led him then, in the morning, to go to early Mass before he would go to work. He was there one day as people were lining up after Mass. People would line up after Mass with their statues to have Father Jim bless them. And he was there, and another statue started to cry while he was in the line. We also had Father Jim come over to the convent. Sister Mary Evelyn had Father Jim come over to the convent to talk with all of the teachers. Several of the teachers had statues of the Blessed Virgin there that they brought some from their classrooms. Kitty Brever, who is now my grade partner, had her statue of the Blessed Virgin with her. It was Our Lady of Fatima, and it started to cry. And we held the statue while it was crying. We passed it from one person to the other, and we were all in awe of what was going on. It was almost surreal to believe that all of this could be happening in Lake Ridge. These things happen in small European towns. They don't happen in Lake Ridge, Virginia.
Local priest who claims religious statues cry in his presence has caught the attention of believers and skeptics alike, and it's brought both groups to his church. Now Father Jim Bruse and others at the church are praying for the day when all the TV coverage and public attention is over.
And if I can believe this, how much greater is this incredible miracle of the Eucharist? And the same God that can cause things to happen that shouldn't happen, that I see happening, I witness happening over and over again. If I can believe my senses, I need to believe what my faith tells me as well.
Dominus tecum, benedicat in mulieribus, et